Pleasant Street entrance, the parking lot here, and I'm going to be giving you a quick introduction to the plants, trees, shrubs, herbs you will see if you walk on the trails here. And I'm going to start with one that I always begin with my students with. It's a plant that everybody should know, even if all they like to do is take a walk in the woods. And that plant is poison ivy. Poison ivy has a three-part leaf. See the three parts there? They look like three separate leaves until you get used to the idea that leaves can have more than one part. Okay? The leaves sometimes have coarse teeth or have like splits. Like this one here has a split. Okay? And the plant contains an oil. That oil is an allergen for most people. It will give you a really itchy rash that could last for more than a week. I'm not going to touch it because I'm pretty allergic to it myself. People who think they're not allergic to it may be right, but they should be careful because allergies can change. I want to show you a couple of plants that are sometimes mistaken for poison ivy. Again, here's the poison ivy. Okay, this here, right next to it, is called Virginia creeper. And it has coarsely toothed leaflets also, coarsely toothed parts to its leaf. But you'll notice there are 5 parts that come together from a center, kind of like the fingers of your hand. Okay? So that's Virginia creeper. It's a vine. Poison ivy also acts like a vine. Okay, one other that's very commonly mistaken for poison ivy, but is also not dangerous, is right here. This is... These are brambles. Brambles are plants like blackberries and raspberries, and they can have, they often have either 3-parted leaves or 5-parted leaves. And the leaves can be kind of ragged. One difference is that these leaves have sharp teeth along the edge. Another difference is they have thorns, which is a reason why when you see something with 3 leaflets, you might want to leave it alone anyway. Of course, blackberries and raspberries in season are very tasty. Okay, now we're going to move on to trees. I'm going to start with a city tree that you don't normally find in the woods, but since Brockton is a city, we have it. And this is an exotic species. It comes from Europe. Okay. And this is Norway maple. This is the leaf of a Norway maple. Now you'll notice it has a very broad leaf. It looks a little bit like a sugar maple leaf, except sugar maple leaves tend to be about as long as they are broad instead of being broader than they are long. Okay? And this bark of the Norway maple is this ridged bark right here. And this big tree right here. Alright, so there's the ridge bark. Alright. Now we're going to look at a couple of canopy trees that are natives. Okay? And these are oaks. We have oaks right here. 2 big ones right next to each other. And the oaks, there are many, many species of oaks, but they divide in our area neatly into a handful that fall into 2 groups. And these 2 groups have different leaves. Okay. So one group of oaks has leaves with bristles at the tips of the lobes. These sticky out parts are called lobes. And there's a bristle at the tip of each lobe. It's not sharp, but it doesn't hurt you, but it's quite sharp. On the other hand, you have leaves that have rounded lobes with no bristles at the tip. Okay? These here that have the bristle-tipped lobes are black oak. And this over here that has the rounded lobe are white oak. So black oak, bristle-tipped, white oak, rounded. Another tree that's related to black oak is red oak. Notice it also has bristles at the tips of the leaves, sharply pointed lobes. Okay? But if you put them side by side, you'll notice that the red oak is kind of more filled in than the black oak. Okay? The lobes are shorter, or you can say the sinuses, the U-shaped notches, are not as deep in the red oak. Now, these trees here, two that I first showed you, show the bark characteristics of those two bristle-tipped leaved oaks. Black oak has a bark that is sort of ridged but blocky. The ridges are broken into blocks. Let me get a little closer. So that's black oak. Okay, and that's a mature trunk. Okay, this one over here has bark characteristic of red oak. Red oak is more stripy, and the ridges are not broken as much into blocks. Actually, if you look at the foliage way up high, you find that this tree might actually be a black oak. I'm not completely certain of it. Still, the bark is pretty characteristic. This is red oak with its stripy, some people say it's pink stripes, and this is black oak, which is more blocky. White oak, if I see one, I'll mention it, but it has bark that's a little bit like the shingles of a house. Okay, we're going to look at two more trees that are both hickories. Hickories have multiple leaves, kind of like poison ivy and Virginia creeper that I mentioned before. Hickory, the two hickories around here, have a 5 or sometimes 7-part leaf. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. By the way, if telling a simple leaf with only one part from a compound leaf with more than one part is challenging, what you can do is you can follow the leaf stem back until you find a bud. And when you find a bud, you say, aha, I've gotten to the base of this leaf, and so this whole thing is one leaf. Okay, so both of the hickories right in this neighborhood have leaves like this, but their bark is quite different. The more common one has very, very, very tightly ridged, finely ridged bark. It looks like this. And this tight bark is characteristic of a tree called pignut hickory. So this is a pignut hickory tree. While I'm here, I'm just going to point out we do have a white oak to compare. Remember, the white oak has the rounded lobes, okay? And I showed you the leaf but not the bark. This is a white oak tree. And I know that because if I look up here, I can find the rounded lobed leaves here. Focus is not very good, but they are rounded lobes. Okay? There we go. There's rounded lobes right there. Okay. All right, now on to the other hickory. The other hickory is very distinctive. It's called shagbark hickory, and you will know it instantly when you see it because it has a trunk like this. You look at those, it looks like it's exploding. There's bark pieces coming off all over the place. Those bark pieces, by the way, are hard and very sharp-edged and sharp-pointed. So if you pick one up off the ground, be a little bit careful with it. It's like almost like handling broken glass. Okay, so that's shagbark hickory. The tree with the tightly ridged bark, it's very not at all shaggy, is called pignut hickory. The leaves are pretty similar. Notice that climbing up this tree is, guess what? Let's look at it. 5 leaflets coming from a center. Is it poison ivy? No, it isn't. It is Virginia creeper. Okay. And here, just for another little quiz, here is a leaf. All right, here we go. Right here, a broad, simple leaf. And this is, and here's the tree right here. Here's the bark. This is Norway maple. This tree is young, so its bark has not developed the deep ridges it will later on. Okay, so now what have we done? We've done 3 kinds of oaks: black oak, red oak, both of which have bristle-tipped lobes, and white oak, which has a bark that's a little bit shreddier and has the rounded lobes. We've done poison ivy and Virginia creeper and brambles right here. Brambles like blackberries and raspberries, which sometimes have the younger leaves. The younger plants have a 5-part leaf, and the older plants have a 3-part leaf like this one. But they are sharply toothed edges, and thorns. So if you hurt yourself on thorns, you know you're at least not going to get a rash because poison ivy has no thorns. Okay. Now we're going to, I want to point out a plant that is going to fool you if you're in a hurry and you see it low down. Okay, and that is this one here. You look at this leaf and you say, ah, that's a maple. But then you keep on looking at it and you realize the leaves almost look too good to be true. They're very, very neat. They're very, very even. All right? They're neatly paired. And this doesn't get to be a big tree. This is actually a kind of viburnum, which is called, guess what? Maple-leaved viburnum. Another clue that you're not looking at maple is because viburnums, instead of having the double-winged things with a seed in each wing, they have these things that are more like berries in a cluster. Okay, so this is maple-leaf viburnum. Our brambles here have berries, although the berries have a ways to go to get ripe. And I know that this is probably a blackberry, not a raspberry, because blackberries have green underneath their leaf, whereas raspberries are more white. All right, let's go down the way a little bit and look at a couple more things. Okay, here is a shrub, or sometimes a small tree. It's actually not very common, but it seems to be here. This is American hazelnut. If you look at this leaf, can you see why it would be called a double-toothed leaf? It looks like it has big teeth that in turn have smaller teeth. It also has, at the base of each leaf, little stipules, things like almost like little tiny leaves of their own. They're in pairs at the base of each leaf, right here. Those stipules and the double-toothed leaves tell you you're looking at American hazelnut. Okay, we're going to look at a couple of ferns along the way. First, there's this real big one. This one is about 4 feet tall, has gigantic leaves. Again, got to get used to the idea. A leaf can have more than one part. So this whole thing right here, this entire thing, is one leaf. It's about 3 feet long. Maybe, actually, it's 4 feet long. That's one leaf. It's a very robust fern. It's called cinnamon fern. And if you see it later in the year, you'll sometimes see a stalk coming up the middle that's a cinnamon brown color, and it's how the plant produces spores so it can reproduce itself. Very close to this large cinnamon fern, all the stems coming from one center, all the leaves emerging from a center, you have a much, 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 much smaller fern. Okay, much smaller, much finer, and quite pretty. Okay, let's see if I can find a prettier example. Again, this whole thing is one leaf. This is called New York fern. So we have cinnamon fern, which is big, and we have New York fern, which is quite small. It's perhaps a foot tall. All right, let's see. What do we have here? I have, quiz here, a 5-parted leaf. I can't tell yet what kind it is because the tree is very young and hasn't developed its characteristic adult bark, but I know this is some kind of hickory. All right. Now, you've already learned this maple tree here. All right, this is Norway maple. But there is a native maple that's also very common throughout the east and the northeast. Okay, a native maple. Now notice the shape of that leaf. It's broader than it is long, and it's got smooth edges pretty much except for the points at the ends of the lobes. Now here's another tree. I'm going to see if I can get close enough to... all right, I've got to walk a little bit. I thought I was looking at a red maple, and it turned out it wasn't. Okay, so I'm seeing more Norway maple here. All right. Walking down the path. I'm noticing, okay, Here's a tree beginning to develop bark that's coming off in strips. So this is what? This is a shagbark hickory. Okay? And I go along a little further. Right. I'm looking for a red maple, which I know is in here, and I'm not finding it. I'll stop along the way to notice this big shrub, or sometimes small tree, which has a leaf that's kind of strange looking. Let's look at this for a moment and see what's strange about it. Okay, for one thing, the leaf is uneven at the base. If you look at the base of the leaf, it's longer on one side than it is on the other side. Okay? Its leaves are in pairs here. The other thing is, the edge of the leaf is not smooth, but it's also not toothed or lobed. It's kind of wavy-edged. This wavy edge. When you see that in a shrub, you know you're looking at witch hazel. Witch hazel, if you've heard the name before, probably because you've seen it in the drugstore, because you can buy witch hazel extract, which is made from the bark and also has rubbing alcohol in it. It's used, people use it on their skin. Here's a bigger witch hazel shrub over my head here. Again, wavy-edged leaves, uneven leaf bases, witch hazel. Okay, here's the maple I was looking for. So you learned Norway maple, which is a non-native and has leaves wider than long, and has leaves that are quite smooth. And then you have this one, which if you look at it, you'll realize isn't smooth at all. It's toothed. And instead of what looks like 5 lobes, 5 sticky out bits, this has more like 3. Okay, so it's a little longer than it is wide. It's got a toothed leaf instead of a smooth leaf. So instead of just having points at the ends of the lobes, it has teeth all the way around the edge. Okay, and it has a bark that is a little looser. It's a little bit looser. It's a little less tightly ridged than Norway maple. And this is red maple. Red maple is a native. It's grown here forever. So it's long before humans brought Norway maple over. It's sometimes called swamp maple, but now it grows everywhere, not just in swamps, probably because when humans got here, they decided they didn't like forest fires, and red maple is quite sensitive to fire. And so before humans started interfering with fires, they grew mainly in wetlands, which don't burn as often. Okay. Let's see. This fern is not very big, but you can see the coarse leaves, 2 feet tall at least. That's cinnamon fern. Here's a large-leafed, young witch hazel. Okay. Right here we have brambles. Are they raspberry or blackberry? They're blackberry because they're green underneath. I'm going down the trail here. Now, I'm going to show you a multi-part leaf that's different from those you've seen already. I just have to find a better example. Here we go. Here's a nice one. You look at this, and your first thought might be, oh look, here's a 5-parted leaf. Okay, then you step back and you realize that wherever you see this plant, those 5 parts occur in a trio. So actually, this is not a 5-parted leaf. It's a 3 parts, which each have 5 parts. So kind of like a fern leaf, it's split and then split again. This leaf comes directly from the soil, okay, It's growing right from here. Alright? And you'll only see just this one leaf every year, and every year this leaf will die back to the ground, and the plant will grow again from its perennial root underground. This is called wild sarsaparilla, or sarsaparilla, but it's spelled sarsaparilla. And if you think sarsaparilla, you think, oh, maybe soda from 100 years ago was flavored with real sarsaparilla. This is wild sarsaparilla, and I do not know whether you can get a tasty extract from it or not. Okay, here's our third fern. Now you notice this fern is in between in size to cinnamon fern and New York fern, but the leaves are very, very finely divided, unlike the cinnamon fern, which is much coarser. Okay, and also you'll notice this leaf has a smell. If you take a little piece of it and you crush it and hold it to your nose, okay, you'll find it has a very nice smell, and very mild but very, very pleasant smell. And in fact, if you have a lot of this together and the wind is just right, you can often smell it before you see it. It's called hay-scented fern. Hay-scented fern. So that's our third fern here. Here's some brambles. Okay. Blackberry. I have brambles, a lot of brambles in my yard, but they're all raspberries, so they all have white underneath, but it's okay. They're tasty to eat either way. So this is a whole bank of hay-scented fern. Hay-scented fern spreads very rapidly. It's almost a weed-like fern. And so you tend to see big banks of it instead of like individual plants like cinnamon fern or New York fern. Okay, here's our five-parted leaf of some kind of hickory. Again, the bark is kind of young. The tree is kind of young. It looks like it's going to be, oh no, I can see already. It looks like the bark is getting shreddy. So this is probably a shagbark hickory. All right. Continue down the path a little bit further. What is this? Let's see. Simple leaves, just a single part, wavy-edged, uneven bases. Okay, that's witch hazel. Here's a plant, a tree that everybody should know. This is not a great example of it, but sometimes you'll see a tree which has more than one shaped leaf. Here we have a simple leaf that has just an even edge. Then we have one that looks a little bit like a mitten. It has one lobe coming off the side. And then we have one that looks like a sort of weird double mitten with two thumbs, one coming off each side. This is a very young one, but this is sassafras. Sassafras is another plant that produces an extract that sometimes used to flavor drinks. And I think root beer was originally flavored with sassafras. Okay, it's not a good example because it's still very small. Very small trees, very young trees, are often harder to identify than when they're older because they often have somewhat less regular leaf shapes than the adults. Okay, now here's a tree. I'll save you the trouble. I'll tell you this is an oak. Notice it has rounded leaf edges, rounded lobes, no points. So what is this? This is a baby white oak. Okay, while I'm here, I'm going to mention one other tree very common around here. This has simple leaves. So this is one leaf right here that I'm holding in my hand. This is one leaf. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate leaves, each one with a bud at the base. Okay, it's kind of the edge is somewhat toothed. Okay, not very sharply toothed, but fairly sharply toothed. Okay, and the bark. This is not the same tree, but the bark right next to it here is kind of shreddy. So I'm pretty sure this is the same tree, but not quite. The bark of the young trees is reddish and often has these little white marks on the bark. Can't quite focus. Alright, little white mark. I'm going to put my hand behind it to get the focus better. Alright, little white marks on the bark. Okay, and this smooth, fairly smooth, quite shiny bark with the white marks, and these simple toothed leaves, okay, is black cherry. And black cherry, it has an edible fruit if you get it at the right time, but it's very, very sour. I was looking for a white pine to show you because there's white pine in here also. If I see white pine, oh yeah, here's white pine, here's baby white pine. This is not going to show you what the adult looks like, but you can see the needles, all right? This is white pine. The needles are in bunches. If you get hold of one bunch of needles and you pluck it and you pull them apart, you'll find there's 5 needles in a typical bundle in white pine. But really, you seldom have to look at the needles. There's only 2 pines that are common around here. One is white pine and the other is pitch pine. White pine is the more graceful. It has much finer needles, much softer needles. As when they're full grown, they have an almost blue-green appearance to them. And they look almost like long feathers coming off the trunk. The branches do. Okay. Pitch pine you find growing in dry places like in sand, which doesn't hold water very well. And pitch pine has more of a bottle brush appearance, and instead of being blue-green, it's more of a yellow-green color. You won't find that here because the soil is not dry enough for pitch pine here. Okay, here's a tree with sort of ridged bark. Not especially characteristic. Then you look upward and you see that it has leaves, simple leaves. Looks like a maple leaf, but they're toothed all around. They're sharply toothed all around. Okay, and longer than wide. So this is red maple. It's a native maple. Okay. And I think that we're going to end the field trip here. I hope you have a good time walking in the Brockton Audubon Preserve. I'll leave with a view of a young white pine.